Thank you very much. I think I can start, right? Yeah, we were getting together here in Brussels. Hello, everybody. My name is Hein Hobbelen. I'm a partner here in Brussels, in Bird & Bird, and I wish to say a warm welcome to all of you here and online. I just saw that already almost 80 people online, so really great that you are listening to this event. And welcome really on behalf of our Brussels Competition, Trade and Public Affairs team, which we have integrated here, and really a warm welcome, obviously, to our friends from the European University Institute in Florence. We are very happy with so many years of cooperation, and also a warm welcome, obviously, to those who are speaking today. And dear all, today we are here to talk about the interplay between sector-specific regulation and antitrust law, and that is a debate which goes quite long back in time. When I started in telecoms liberalization. I was still practicing in the Netherlands, and there was a lot of debate. Can we deal with things with competition law? And I'm already as old that I remember that debate, and it's really back. And I was thinking about this debate when recently I was sitting in a restaurant, and there was a couple sitting next to me and my family, and they were really fighting. They were really fighting. You couldn't miss it. It was a bit embarrassing. It was almost like in a Hollywood movie, and it was about the education of their children. And it was about flexibility, expectations, being rigid, being firm. It was a little bit a metaphor of the debate we have again on the interplay of regulation and competition law. And I think this debate is a bit like the couple which is disputing about the education of the children. One says, "My darling regulation," says antitrust, "I really need you to be more present again. I feel I cannot really deal anymore with things, for example, screen time and big tech." And then regulation says, "But my darling competition, are these not some odd feelings? What are the facts? Is it not simply that you feel things haven't moved quickly enough, but were you just starting to get to grips with things?" Yes, darling regulation, that's part of the story, but I feel things need to be more structured, anticipated, based on clear preset rules and understandings. And darling antitrust, regulation may be more structured and anticipative, but behaviors and conduct of children, they are unpredictable. Current behaviors may be replaced soon. And our existing rules that we set here, which took years to get in place, may have become obsolete already again. But darling regulation, I know, but the outside world says all the time, I'm late, I'm not effective, and that nobody really cares about my remedies. What, darling antitrust? Have you attended too many events of your star, Christina Caffarra, again? And who cares about what the outside world says? Let's intervene together. Let us do a dawn raid. Yes, darling regulation, that's true. There we can both go ahead, but you can bring more external consultants than I. Well, perhaps we have both not been bold enough, or actually too ambitious and interventionist. And should we just let things go and back off? What? Have you been in Chicago again? Please, my darling, let's stop fighting. Yes, it's confusing. The reality is we are both there. Nobody wishes to drop out. So together, we'll have to make the best of it. This is just an anecdote, I think, of the current debate. And Marco, I think the book that you present today here in Brussels could not be more timely and could not be presented at a better place, because you presented at Bird & Bird, where we have been dealing for decades with regulation, where we now look at the interplay with antitrust. We've kept our regulatory focus for years, and we have now thoroughly invested in our antitrust practice. So we are very happy that you are here to present your book and to look at the learnings from telecoms, liberalization and regulation for many years, where this debate has been going on for a long time, and also obviously in healthcare. So the floor is yours, Marco. Welcome to all. And I wish you a fantastic event here in Brussels and online with us today. Thank you.
So, thank you, Rainer. Thank you, Bird, for hosting us once again. I think it is the fourth time that we organize this seminar together. It's always our pleasure. Unfortunately, Professor Parker cannot be here. He's the director of our program. He doesn't feel well today, so I have the task to replace him. I would like to start with a short overview of our activities in Florence. At the moment, we are called the Center for a Digital Society. This is our new brand. We started our activities in November last year. The CDS merges two programs that previously existed at the UI, the Florence School of Regulation, Communication and Media, and the Florence Competition Program, into a single program focused on digitalization. So we look at competition, regulation, innovation, and a new core area for us is also the impact of digitalization on the democratic process. In terms of activities, we continue to do what we have been doing for over 10 years in terms of conducting policy-applied research, organizing executive training education, as well as policy events like this one today. This is our team, which is expanding. We are expecting 2 new postdoc researchers to join our team in the coming months. And we are also supported by a scientific committee, including economists and lawyers who have expertise in this field. We also have concluded with the year's memorandum of understanding and cooperation with a number of international organizations and other partner institutions. And of course, we have to say thank you to our donors like Bird and Bird, with whom we have been cooperating for several years and who has been supporting our activities in Florence. So before we start, let me provide you an overview of our next incoming activities. So in terms of training, we are currently finishing a training on mergers control in the digital economy, which is actually ongoing, and we have a virtual class today. Our next training will take place in June. There is a small mistake in the slides. It's 5th of June until 7th of July, actually. It will be fully online and will be about the interaction of competition policy and ex-ante regulation. So somehow the topic of today's event, but clearly ex-ante regulation in that case will be the Digital Market Act, applied in a different digital sector like search engine, social networks, and so on. Also, one of our core activities are training for national judges that we have been organizing, both with a focus on telecom or electronic communications, but also in competition law. And this year, our entrance program, the final workshop of the entrance program, will take place at the Court of Justice in Luxembourg. We'll then have 2 hybrid courses open to an external audience in Florence, one focused on patent licensing, another one on competition law, on recent development in competition law in October. In terms of policy events which are in planning, we have, I would like to flag 2 events. One is a webinar, which is taking place in April, 19th of April, will be fully online, and the topic will be very close to what we are going to discuss today in the first panel. So the webinar will focus on the current ongoing public consultation on connectivity organized by DG Connect. And then we will have our summer conference that we organized with the OECD Secretariat on global data governance, which will take place on 22nd and 23rd of June. What about today? So as I mentioned, this is sort of, it's the 4th time I counted that we come to Brussels, that we are hosted by Bird and Bird. We would like to launch, to present the book that I have the pleasure to edit with Professor Monti and Professor Parco on the interaction of competition law and sector regulation. The topic of the book, obviously, is in line with the topic of the seminar today, and the book was published in December last year, so a couple of months ago. So we'll focus on two specific examples of interaction between competition law and sector regulation. So we will look at the current debate on net neutrality and fair sharing in investment in the telecom sector. And the second panel will focus on excessive pricing in the pharmaceutical sector. There have been a lot of investigation during the last years, both by the European Commission, but also by a number of competition authorities. And clearly the type of topic overlaps with price regulation in the pharmaceutical sector. We'll then have at the end of the afternoon, before the cocktail, one keynote speech. Paul Cesar, director from DG Comp, will close the event before the final cocktail. So, a couple of practical information for those of you connected via Zoom. So we will, please don't turn on your microphone and your camera. This was already mentioned before, but let me repeat it. You can interact, and you are very warmly invited to interact by asking questions on the Q&A via Zoom. The event will be recorded, so the video recordings and also the PowerPoint presentation will be available on the event webpage after the conference. So this is the, let's say, the coverage of the book. So the books, the origin of the books is our training program for national judges, entrance for judges, that we organize in Florence thanks to the funding of DG Comp since 2011. So it's already 12 years that we organize this training program. We have counted over 400 judges from 24 member states have attended this training program in Florence, and every year we have a similar structure. We have a residential training and a final workshop and online activities in between, but the topic changes every year. So for instance, this year, the topic has been recent developments on Article 102. And 2 years ago, the topic was the interaction of competition law and sector regulation in the energy, telecom, and pharmaceutical sector. So this is the topic of the book. So the entrance book is published every year after every edition of Entrance for Judges. The chapters are written usually by the speakers and by some judges attending the training program. And the overall idea of all these books, we have at the moment 5 books, is to analyze emerging trends at the national and EU level in different areas. So as you can see, the first book dates back to 2016, and in the meantime, we have analyzed episode dominance, private enforcement, up to the interaction of competition law and sector regulation, published in December last year. So what can I say about the book? I mean, usually you have to read the book in order to better understand what it's about. We have several contributions from a number of scholars, both lawyers and economists. There are several, as I mentioned before, this topic of interaction of competition law and sector regulation is an evergreen topic that we have been discussing for so many years, let's say. What we try to do in the book is to, let's say, investigate, to analyze more recent trends that we have seen in the 3 industries analyzed. For instance, there is a lot of debate, a lot of interaction between these 2 legal areas. If you talk about the co-investment agreements in building very high capacity networks. Of course, these type of agreements are encouraged by sector regulation, but they might, there is a lot of, I would say, cooperation between different competitors. They might be suspicious under competition law. The same about excessive pricing in the pharmaceutical sector. That's the topic of the second panel today. And we have 4 chapters written on these topics inside of the book. Clearly, we have an overlap between Article 102A, so a number of authorities sanctioning this type of conduct, and patent rights and pharmaceutical regulation. So the price of drugs are often already regulated. This is the list of chapters included in the book. I have highlighted the name of the contributors who are with us. I'm happy that several of the speakers today are actually contributors of the book. So I would say the idea is that we depart from the book, but then we have a discussion on, let's say, recent developments, specifically looking at the telecom sector in the first panel and at the pharmaceutical sector in the panel. So I would like to thank you for your attention, for being here with us today. And I now leave the floor to Anna, my colleague, who will moderate the first panel. And I would also like to invite the speakers to the first panel to join the podium so that we can start immediately with the first panel. Thank you.
So we'll just wait a second so we can have Martin with us. Yes? Martin Kay will be joining online. Unfortunately, he's not able to join us in person. But while we are waiting for Martin to connect, maybe what I can refer to, Marco has already mentioned the event that we will have on the 19th of April. It's going to be a webinar seminar. And what is going to be different about that particular event from so many events that you have right now at the moment on this topic is that being an academic institution, we are going to bring on board also academics. So the idea is that we will have one afternoon, which will include 2 sessions, one with academics, second with people from the industry. And then we want to create a discussion between both of them so they can kind of test their ideas. And I hope they will be open, of course, to that. So it won't stay on a superficial level. And people will not repeat what we have been listening and hearing all over the places for the last few weeks. So this event, as I said, will take place on the 19th of April, and we will provide more information, but you can find everything on our website. Now it's, sorry, it's not working now. Okay, perfect. So you see 4 speakers, but unfortunately, as Marco has already mentioned, Pierluigi will not be able to join us. And we will therefore have 3 still very distinguished speakers, Martin Cave, Gera van de Voorde, and Peter Alex. All of them are distinguished speakers, competent and expert in both competition and regulation in industries. I think they require no presentation, but still I would like to mention a few words about them. Martin is an economist, Gera and Peter are lawyers. They have been working on this on competition and economic regulation for a number of years. But an interesting thing about Martin that I have discovered was that in 2009, he was awarded an Order of the British Empire for his public service. And given that this topic is very much about the society and citizens, I think it's very good that we have him with us today. Everyone can hear. Gera is a professor in telecommunications law at Leiden University and also an in-house lawyer at KPN, the Dutch telecom incumbent operator. And Peter is a visiting professor at King's College London, and he has been a founding partner at the Brussels office of Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. And you've been working there since until 2020, I believe, right? And still you remain in the area in any case. So these are the speakers we have today. And before I will raise the questions to them, I want to make a very brief introduction about the topic. So as you all know, the public consultation on the future of electronic communication sector and its infrastructure has been launched recently. And it has 4 different sections, altogether 62 questions, and just a little bit more than 20 are about fair share, or rather, I should say, fair contribution. Roberto Viola yesterday at the Politico event really wanted to emphasize that it's not about fair share, it's about fair contribution. Now, we can get into semantics, we can play games with the words, but I think what really matters is the form of the potential scheme that we would see and not the words that we will use. We can call it internet tax, cost recovery, but still, I think this is not what is relevant today. So these are the four sections of the consultation. It's exploratory consultation, and apparently it's the first time that this type of consultation has been used, which means that the Commission doesn't have any point of view. One of the criticisms about this consultation is that it looks like Commission has already made up its mind. Roberto Viola again was pretty clear. No, they haven't made up their mind yet. So all the options are on the table. Maybe nothing will happen. We will see. There's plenty of criticism about the consultation, whether it's biased, whether the process has been transparent, because the topic was kind of out in the public already 1 year ago. But I think this is not what is relevant today, because if we criticize the consultation itself, we will, hi Sarah, we'll just remain at the very superficial level, whereas I think it's really important to get into details. And that's what I would like to do. The consultation is not just about fair contribution, it's about the future of the connectivity itself. And this is important because we have the European Declaration, which is a joint declaration from the European Parliament, the Council, and the European Commission, in which these three institutions commit to ensure that there will be adequate framework for a fair and proportionate contribution of all the actors who benefit from the digital economy, that everyone should have access to excellent connectivity, and that open internet should remain. So there is no discussion about open internet. And in fact, in the public consultation, there is not a single question about net neutrality. Again, Roberto Viola, when he was asked about why there is not a single question about that, he replied, because there is nothing to change in open internet regulation. So it's going to stay with us apparently. And it looks like it's not being questioned at all. On top of the declaration, which is not a binding instrument, there is a political commitment in the decision, which has established the Digital Decade Policy Program. So these digital targets that you can see here clearly demonstrate that the importance of connectivity is not just because the networks are the bedrock of the future value creation in the EU, but they are really important for the citizens also, so they can democratically participate in the state, and also they can access public services, because one of the goals is to increase digitalization of public services. Hence, no adequate connectivity, you may not be able to use public services. If I'm not mistaken, in Finland, some of the services are already exclusively available online. So connectivity is really important for so many reasons, not just from the competition and sectoral regulation perspective. Again, the commitment to have fair contribution is mentioned in the decision. So whereas before we had it in the declaration, now it's also in the decision, which is a binding instrument. Again, it stopped. Sorry. I think when you use, then I lose control of the, no problem. So what is the issue? We are not going to question the digital targets themselves. We are going to take them at face value. And hence the question is, how do we get from where we are today to the digital targets that have been defined by the Commission? What are the problems? And it seems that one of the main problems is the investment gap, which has been estimated at 65 billion euro per year. And this is only in relation to the interim targets of 2025, but of course they are going to be higher if we talk about 2020 targets. So what are the main problems? Why do we have this issue of suboptimal investment? Experts in the field have identified a number of issues, and here is just a list of them. You may disagree. It's not that they are definitely the problem, but those that have been discussed are fragmented European market, which means that we haven't, or let's say that 4 to 3 mergers are an issue. They have happened in some countries, but then we have seen that they are not really accepted. And there is also lack of incentives for cross-border consolidation. The head of Liberty Global at the Mobile Summit in Barcelona has said that you can't have cross-border consolidation, hence you cannot have pan-European champions if you do not allow first in-country consolidation. Hence the question, does the sequencing of consolidation matter? And if it does, then we should discuss it again, whether 4-3 mergers should be treated more flexibly. In terms of mergers and as in terms of regulation, one of the criticism has been that it has focused too much on the static welfare effects, hence lower prices for consumers, and not on the dynamic effects, hence investment. The fact that we have fragmented markets, loads of players, means that prices have been low, but it also means that average revenue per user has been low, which is problematic if you need money to invest. This average revenue per user has been declining in the mobile industry, and it has been declining despite the fact that the quality of broadband has been improving. So with each subsequent technology in the mobile industry, we get better broadband, but the prices keep going down. Regulation has been criticized for being overly restrictive. There has been discussion also about net neutrality rules. Apparently, there are very few empirical studies about the impact of net neutrality on firms' decisions. So net neutrality is a very interventionist approach to what firms can and cannot do. Yet, despite the fact that there are many theoretical studies, there are not many that would apparently discuss the impact on firms' decisions in general and investment in particular. Heterogeneity and fragmented nature of the European market means that also there are different prices for spectrum. Again, in some countries there have been really high, in some they have been lower, but spectrum prices are one of the issues. Uncertain business case for 5G and low willingness to pay from the consumer perspective, which seems to be a problem that have been kind of already dealt with, that the situation has been improved, but still there is a question about that. And all these aspects together raise the general question: how does the telecom sector perform in general in comparison to other sectors? Because most of the telecom companies are listed on the stock exchanges, and they take capital also from private investors. Of course, if I'm a private investor and I have a responsibility to also to stakeholders, where I'm going to invest. I'm going to invest where I'm going to have return on investment, return on the capital I have invested, in a relatively short period of time. So there is this pressure now to have return on investment quicker rather than longer. This is problematic in the telecom sector because the nature of investment is cyclical, so it keeps being repeated, especially in the mobile networks. But it also means that if I'm a telecom company going to an investor, they know that today I have to give you money for 4G spectrum auction, but in a few years, you'll ask me for money for 5G spectrum auction. And what is happening today? We have telecom operators who have to simultaneously deploy fiber networks, 4G, 5G, and most probably in 2028 or around that time, we will have auctions for 6G, hence again, more money. Investors may not be really willing to keep giving money, especially if the return on the investment takes really many years. So these are the issues, and we have to consider them in the context where telecommunication markets has changed drastically, and the business models of incumbent operators or telecom operators in general have been under attack, both on the wholesale and the retail market. So not an easy situation for telecom operators, for sure. So how the telecom operators responded to the pressure that has come with the emergence of OTTs, over-the-top players, and content application providers? It depends, of course, on what type of services OTTs and CAPs provide. But here I would like to mention that the debate about fair share is not a new debate. It has already taken place a few years ago when Nelly Cross has told the telecom operators, adapt or die. At that time, telecom operators complained about the pressure from OTTs and CAPs. But apparently, the European Commission didn't think that there was a problem. What happened back then was that OTTs provided services that were competitive vis-a-vis services offered by the telecom incumbents. And they were competitive to the extent, not only competitive, but those services have actually cannibalized revenues in the core services of telecom operators. On top of that, at that time, OTTs were not under the definition of the regulatory framework. It's only with the 2018 Electronic Communications Code that OTT has been officially recognized as providing electronic communication services. Of course, not all of them, but it's just some. We don't have time now to go into details. In any case, before that, there were some court cases, but the important thing is OTTs were providing a competing service that was cannibalizing telecom operators' revenues at the time where their services were not officially falling under the regulatory telecommunications framework. So in response to the services that OTTs provide, telecom operators can either do nothing, which of course would be not a very reasonable solution. They can defend themselves, or they can attack, or they can cooperate. And we have seen a little bit of everything throughout the last years. The debate that we have today about fair contribution is very much driven by the fact that so much traffic on telecom networks come from just a very few companies. So different sources provide different figures, but more or less we're talking about 50 to 60%. According to Sandvine report, this number has decreased because other applications have become a bit more popular. That's why you can see that it's now 48%. But in any case, this is the problem. And one of the questions that I'm asking myself is, if I'm a company and I have to make a customer-oriented investment, then usually what do I do? It's about recovering the cost of this customer-specific investment. I can reach an agreement with this company. A very good example comes from the postal sector, where Amazon has signed an agreement with Poste Italiane. And what was the reason behind this agreement? Amazon needs very fast delivery beyond traditional hours that Poste Italiane would have. But Poste Italiane, being a universal service provider in the postal sector, has capillarity of the network that Amazon, despite owning some part of the logistics, doesn't have. Hence, this agreement between them was about increasing the capacity and the quality of Poste Italiane network. So we have an example of customer-specific investment where an agreement was reached. How is this different from the telecom sector, where apparently we can have a problem? Also, in this regard, I will mention that there's currently an ongoing case in Germany where Meta has stopped paying Facebook. So it was paying, but it stopped. I don't have information about why they have stopped, but agreements between CAPs and telecoms operators have been there. But now maybe CAPs feel that we can simply stop, because what will happen? Telcos, they have to comply with the net neutrality rules, hence they cannot throttle or block our traffic. They can go to court, but it might take time, and then we'll see what will happen. We'll take our chances. The topic is clearly hotly debated. There are a number of studies that have already emerged. It is important to bear in mind that most of these studies have been commissioned by different stakeholders. So the first one has been commissioned by the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate. The study by Communications Chambers, written by Williamson, has been commissioned by an association, members of which are mostly big players. There's only one telecom operator, which is British Telecom. And Axon and Frontier studies have been commissioned by Aetna and incumbent operators. There's also a preliminary assessment from BEREC, and the most widely cited academic paper at the moment is from the Toulouse School of Economics, written by Bruno Julien. So I'm sure there will be plenty of more studies and articles coming out. But what are the issues? For sure, data traffic growth is increasing, but it's also unpredictable how it will change, because today we have seen that over 50% comes from only these 5 companies. But with 5G, IoT, machine-to-machine, and device-to-device traffic, maybe we're going to see some evolution in traffic and more traffic from the verticals. So is it feasible to have any legislation in the next 2 years when we do not know how the traffic will evolve? Another issue is asymmetric bargaining power between major OTTs and CAPs. And in that regard, the BEREC's preliminary assessment said that there is no problem but there is no problem in the IP traffic, whereas most of the problem about the investment is actually in the last mile, so within the country, not on the edge of the network. The question about whether the broadband market should be treated as a vertical supply market, two-sided market, or maybe a connectivity ecosystem, because we talk about digital ecosystems where we have the core that actually gains money from all the ecosystem. But at the bottom of this ecosystem, we have telecom operators, and maybe they have been left outside of the ecosystem. And if they have, can we talk about ecosystem failures in addition to market failures? And finally, the question of fair share and net neutrality. Can they coexist? And can we have a level playing field with net neutrality rules that we have in Europe? Net neutrality rules do not exist everywhere. In the US, they had net neutrality rules, then they removed them, then they are discussing again what to do. In Australia and New Zealand, that there are no net neutrality rules. So with this, I would like now to turn questions to the speakers. Yes. Yes, sure. Apologies.
Is there anyone here who maybe parked a white Tesla in the garage? There's an issue.
So, Martin, I would like to start with you. Unfortunately, we have lost Pierluigi as another economist on the panel. So my first question would be, what has changed in comparison to the situation 10 years ago? And what is the underlying problem and the main economics in this debate that we have today about, call it fair contribution or fair share?
Okay, well, thanks and apologies for not being able to be there in person. I see I'm sort of towering over the audience in a very large picture. I hope it's not going to be too frightening. And I can assure you, Anna, I'm perfectly capable of holding two possibly distinct opinions on most economic questions. So
no doubt about that.
I'll be able to do with them. But first of all, I thought your slides are an absolute tour de force. They really do explain it very well, what's going on and the situation we're getting at. And then the first question you asked me is what's changed in the situation 10 years ago? And truly the answer is, as you've implied, that almost everything's changed. I mean, there's been enormous traffic growth, development of verticals, new services, Internet of Things, machine to machine, and all these things are going on. At the same time, I think there's an even greater recognition of the importance of connectivity in the digitalization program. I mean, one of the interesting things about the EU's digitization program is that it's universal, it covers everything, and it's very ambitious. And obviously the heart of it lies in these connectivity issues, very important. Now, in more detail, what's changed? There's been a very considerable increase in fixed ISP competition. My contribution to this book is an account of how the directives in 2003 were employed to develop first competition based on unbundled local loops, and then on fiber to the node, and then finally on fiber to the home. And it's a huge success story, in my opinion, for successful pro-competition regulation, and has borne fruit to an extent which I must confess I've been extremely surprised by. So we're now in that market in an expansion phase, and in an expansion phase you quite often get low returns, and there's a focus upon market growth. The outcome has been quite interesting in many ways in terms of the balance between the markets acquired by in fiber to the home by the historic monopolists and by new entrants, often with different business models. So that's been very important, and it has led to a genuinely huge, if across countries, across member states, uneven growth in fiber to the home, and also to a lesser extent in 5G. But the forecasts, I understand, for how much gigabit connectivity will be attained by 2030 suggest that there will still be quite a substantial shortfall going up to there. So in addition to the numbers that you cited in relation to the period to 2025, there will be this this large and expensive tail of gigabit connectivity to be achieved if the objectives of the digital program are to be implemented. So that's what's happened on the operator side. On the CAP side, well, I mean, essentially, the 10 years that we're talking about have seen an absolutely massive growth of large and dominant digital platforms. The digital platforms, as you suggested in your use of the phrase ecosystems, have in some sense sort of extended their range of activities into all sorts of other areas. I mean, particularly, for example, in the case of Google and Facebook, into the digital advertising market. And in my observation, they are very effective and efficient profit maximizers. If you read some of the books written, I guess probably in the middle of the past decade, sort of admiring books written by wired journalists and people of that kind, you appreciate how extraordinarily astute the people who were managing these companies were in expanding their activities and taking advantage of profit opportunities that existed. So now, in essence, it's probably fair to say that they become rich almost beyond the dreams of avarice. Although they do, of course, face what may be increasing volatility. We'll just have to wait and see what's going to happen there. Now, at the same time, we've got the smaller caps, and I think I'd probably be inclined to include in those most of the streaming subscription services, although Netflix is probably an exception. And they are engaged in performing very useful, sort of fairly mundane tasks. They're, things like food ordering platforms, taxi services, things of that kind. And generally speaking, I think it's probably fair to say they're pretty competitive and not particularly profitable. Now, has there been underinvestment in the networks? I haven't studied this in any detail, but my observations of what's happened in the United Kingdom is that there's an enormous difference in different parts of the country. I mean, there are many suburbs in London where lucky householders have a choice of no less than 5, can you believe it, 5 fiber to the home based systems going past their front doors or outside their apartments. And quite honestly, it's quite difficult to see how that's going to be sustainable in the future. On the other hand, there are also areas, and that's obviously true of the whole of Europe, where the penetration is going to be very expensive. I mean, there are these rules that suggest that the last 20% of development of a network is going to cost 40% of the costs and things of that kind. And I think they probably are in play in this particular circumstance. And one of the questions that I must say has puzzled me in the discussions of the fair contributions debate is that there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of focus on that, which I would have thought would be quite an important point to take if the target of universal gigabit connectivity is taken seriously. Now, the next question I think is what's the problem? And I think in this particular process that the Commission is carrying out, it's slightly unusual in that normally in a public policy debate, there's quite a lot of extensive work done by the government or the policymaker, and quite a lot of analysis of what the problem is. And data are presented, although I appreciate the questionnaire is going to generate a huge amount of very interesting data. And then it then goes in an orderly step. Once you know what the problem is, then you can start to think about what the solutions are, and in particular, what are the causes of the problem. And in this case, there are a whole range of potential candidates for the cause. One is market failure, but there are restrictions on entry into particular markets, or the second category is regulatory failure. And then a third category that always comes up is externalities. And then the fourth category, which is which is sort of present here, lurking in the background, as I've suggested, which is distributional goals. And those distributional questions, I think, come quite quickly, and once you start considering what's going to happen. So there is a kind of a fear, I think, that we're going into this discussion without much agreement, or indeed many facts, detailed facts. For example, I think estimates of the shortfall of investment are they can be quite elastic, and they aren't always exactly what they seem. It depends what's happening. So I think we really need to examine very carefully exactly what the scale of the underinvestments by the ISPs is. Now, we've already moved, and I in a sense I rather regret that, without much preliminary discussion, into the debate about what the answer is, and in particular, the notion that there should be some payment which is made by caps to ISPs in order to fund the investments that's necessary.
Martin, maybe before we move into the form and the specific scheme that would be adopted, since you have mentioned the targets, I could ask Gera.
Yes, please do.
How, in her view, connectivity goals fit into the fair share debate? So it would complement what Martin has said so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, and also thank you for the invitation to be here and to share my thoughts, and also to contribute to the book. And I must say, when I finalized my chapter, I was critical as regards of the connectivity goals and the methods used in the telecoms code. But at that time I didn't foresee this fair share, fair contribution discussion. And I think also, Hein, thank you for your introduction, because I think what's on the table between competition and regulation, that's the word fair. It's on the table, because what's that? What's fair for competition? What's fair for regulation? Well, your question, Anna, is what's the relation between connectivity goals and fair share? I think fair share is already part of the connectivity goals. If you look into the telecom code, the telecom code states that the national authorities need to spread investments. They need to look into access arrangements, but also they need to look into the investments in the whole sector. But I think the problem at this time is that, well, the internet ecosystem, it's more than just connectivity on a level of telecom. So that's what you already a little bit pointed out in your introduction. So how are we dealing with aspects outside the telecoms codes, which are relevant for the companies regulated by the telecom codes? So I think we are looking into a more or less holistic approach. And what we see right now is that the telecom codes, it's still harmonization. It's if you look into the goals, it's perfect, just to say it's about connectivity. But if you look into what's in it, it's still, well, more or less based on the old pieces of regulation. So if it talks about spreading investments, it talks about co-invest, so contributions of the incumbents and access seekers, while the world has changed. So it's not the only discussion. So, well, I think that's the struggle. And what you see, well, if you look at, for example, the open network regulation, well, that's a type of regulation which is directed at the telecom operators, because just to say, they were the ones giving internet access, and they were also very easy to pinpoint. And what the regulator tries to do is to also safeguard access to other layers, so the more content layers. And this works well, well, not fully well, because if you talk about access to apps, for example, a net neutrality doesn't really work out. We have the zero rating discussions, of course, but it doesn't really work out. So what you see in the past is that we try to regulate through the telecom sector other piece of the ecosystem. But well,
Yeah, I'm not touching anything and I don't know what's happening here.
so, well, it was not my intention to.
Relevant question.
Yes.
No, do not
Okay,
make sense.
Okay. But that's my first impression. So it fits in, but the telecom code is restricted, and we need to find a holistic way of dealing with the topic, I think.
Okay, thank you, Gara. That's a that's a question to yes, this one from Bird and Bird. Seen that a new legislation about investment. It would have to be compatible with the code, of course, but could it be the solution that the code allows actually to find some mechanism for a contribution or not?
Okay. Well, I think the code can provide a basis. If you look at from the perspective that telecom regulations has found regulation in situations where there's no incentive for a party to act. Just to say, if he found out that by reaching the future connectivity goals, and if he find out that there will not be enough investments, so that we will get a problem taking into all data that needs to be processed, then the question is, could we use the code to impose an incentive for other parties, like the content parties, to think about the way they produce data and transmit it. So the way of thinking about regulation, that can be done under the codes, but we see that in most cases, like it was also with roaming and also with termination rates, that more specific regulation was enacted to deal with this issue. But the first question is there a problem because there's no incentive, and do we need to impose an incentive for other parties than the telecom sector to reach the connectivity goals in the future?
Yeah, my view is that the code was a qualitative leap compared to its predecessors. And if you look at the history of telecommunications regulation, you start off back in 2002, 2003, we have 18 markets. We now have 2. Okay, the big ones, but there's 2. So 18 to 2 is a record that I will tell you will not see in any other sector, in any other part. That's actually a good story to tell of deregulation. That's the first thing. What happened at the time we had 18 markets, and now there are 2? There was no digital platform regulation. What do we have now? We have lots and lots of digital regulation. Some might say too much, but the balance is being redressed. What did we have at the time? We had back in 12 years ago, we started having this fair share debate. I think that was the right time to have the debate. I didn't agree with Nelly Cruz that, let the dogs of war run. That was the time to have the debate, to see what the future will bring, to have a staged, managed approach. Now, the market has gone its particular way, and now we want to patch it up. I agree with Martin, and Martin gets all the interesting questions, by the way. We get the really boring legal ones. I agree with Martin that the question is, how much of that last gap do we need to fill, and how much does it really cost, and can we currently fulfill that gap? That's a relevant question. The other relevant question is, which the President, von der Leyen, has alluded to, is will the metaverse change our appetite? Because that might be a game changer. In broadband, in the state aid guidelines, every time we have a change which satisfies the need for state aid, we say, will it result in a step change? Now, if we go to the metaverse, that might be a step change. That might justify what's going on. But currently, the data that I've seen anyway suggests the following. There is no exponential growth in traffic. There was 12 years ago. Now it's just gradual. There is, however, more regulation on the digital players. They are contributing in building transcontinental fiber. They are contributing in building caches. So that cuts the expenses of TOs to a degree. The code satisfies a lot of results. I mean, the code basically has elevated the pursuit of very high capacity networks as one of the 4 founding goals that didn't exist in the previous iteration. So now you have an on its face goal, which is basically, this is just as important as competition. Okay, that's the first time that's happened. A goal which flies in the face of competition. Having had the privilege of working on the first co-investment deal in Italy, I can tell you the problem was not the regulator as much. It was the competition regulator who couldn't stomach the idea that co-investment under the code, under a lex specialis, could be looked at just in that way, and said, oh, we'll now look at it under competition law. And surprise, surprise, competition law is more onerous in that respect. So, you know, I think competition regulators and telecoms regulators need to get together and sort this out pretty quickly. Because if there's going to be one lex specialis which is going to be overridden by competition law in any event, we're not going to get very far. But I think the paradigms are there, commitments are there, so elements of self-regulation are there. We've just heard that we're going to have higher costs for access to copper lines, so facilitating the migration. We've just got the first joint venture from telcos, Spain, Germany, France, and Vodafone are all getting together to play in the ad tech space. So they're going into value added. They're not playing in dumb pipes. They should have done that a long time ago. You have to ask yourself, why didn't they do that a long time ago? Did they have to get to this point now to wake up? So I think there's a lot of signs there that the code is helping a lot. There are positive dispositions there. The operators themselves have realized that they need to add value. And the other thing is, when you look at all the investment criteria, it might not be particularly great over time. But let me tell you, since the announcement of the code, the investment uptick has been very, very significant. And the investment has been coming from institutional investors outside the traditional telecom. It's been coming from private equity, people like that. Those people like long-term certainty. They know what their goals are. They know what their investments are. And if you say to them, your investment is worth a pile of rubbish because we're going to get it all back off the digital platforms anyway, they're gone. They're going to be gone forever. And then we're just basically playing, let's let regulation do the job. So I'm a little bit worried about that. That's a complex.
I think in that regard, it's worth also mentioning that there is loads of evolution with respect to the layering of different levels of infrastructure. So we have a wholesale-only model now. We have increasingly popular tower companies. And I've been reading that tower companies are performing better than vertically integrated operators because not being kind of heavied or limited by uncertainty coming from the retail market, They are more agile. It's easier for them to attract investment. But if this is the case, I would be also interested to see whether in the future we will see more cross-border consolidation of tower companies where we could have pan-European champion, because first, it's only a company present at a certain level, hence there are no incentives and ability to engage in vertical foreclosure, which is the problem for vertically integrated companies. And being lighter, it's like it could be that they would have more synergies to engage in cross-border consolidation. And maybe then it would be easier to get investment at the specific level. But still, if the problem is in the last mile, then this is not the final solution. So now maybe I would like to get back to Martin and ask whether, Martin, you want to comment on anything that has been said so far. And if not, what do you think about framing the debate about the broadband as a two-sided market? Do you think this is relevant? Do you agree with that type of framing? Because both the Oxera study and Toulouse paper actually adopt this view with relation to the broadband market.
Right. Well, I guess before I get on to that, which I don't actually have a huge amount to say, I'd just like to discuss the options which are available if contributions are going to be made, in terms of gathering the contributions and distributing them. Because what the discussion has moved to, and perhaps rather prematurely in my view, is there just being a standard flat rate. And as soon as a CAP puts something on the internet, then it has to pay the relevant ISP a certain sum of money at a flat rate. And that's a very restricted way of actually trying to achieve whatever objective it is you've decided you're trying to achieve through the policy. Let me give you an example. In energy recently, in the EU and elsewhere, there's been a lot of emphasis upon gathering taxes, windfall taxes from generators, and then just giving the windfall taxes to consumers who otherwise would suffer. And that's a standard sort of public policy thing. You gain contributions through what's essentially a tax system, then you give it to worthy recipients through a benefit system. And if you're doing that, you can be very precise about who you get it from and who you give it to. And it wouldn't have been possible to achieve that kind of precision in the energy sector, just simply by having a flat rate that generators had to pay to consumers, because that would mean, for example, that business customers and household customers would be having to treat it in exactly the same way. So I think it's a pity in a way that we've moved to focus the debate upon what I suspect is a slightly narrow and impoverished means of actually effecting the transfers. And another point which I think is worthy of attention, which brings in market power as well into the consideration, is what the purpose of it is and how costly it is to do the transfers. I mean, in essence, if and this obviously isn't the case, if the CAP side and the ISP side were purely perfectly competitive, then if we imposed a system like that, then basically the CAPs would have to raise their costs, for streaming services, etc., and the ISPs would be forced to lower their costs, and there wouldn't really be much effect. In other words, it would be a faintly futile exercise. But if on the CAP side you've got a bunch of firms available who are extremely profitable, and if you can focus the contributions upon those, you might be able to achieve a different situation in which more money is collected and can then be distributed in a particular way. There are all sorts of tariffs that are in principle capable of doing that. Things like rising block tariffs and so on, bearing in mind the very substantial contributions which the six firms in your slide and which accounted for roughly half the things. So I think there is scope for that. But in terms of whether it's appropriate to analyze these things as two-sided markets or otherwise, I can't help but feel that there's some kind of unnecessary introduction of formality into the situation, because I think the economics of the situation is fairly straightforward, and I think this is one of those occasions where fairly basic economic reasoning, not particularly sophisticated economic reasoning, is quite capable of producing the result. But what I do like about the two-sided market approach is that you can focus upon the consumers, because the consumers are paying for content and the consumers are paying for connectivity. And if those two things are taken together, you can see what the benefit to them is of this process, if any.
Thank you. The next question would be concerns the issue that if there is a transfer from CAPS to ISP, if there is no specific mechanism that would ensure how this money is spent, this money could be spent somewhere else, not necessarily on investment. So do you think that in terms of the legal approach, would there have to be a specific obligation? And if yes, how it would be monitored? What do you think about the legal approach to this?
Okay, if we look at the code and we look at the TSM regulation, clearly the TSM regulation does not provide us with any possibility for a delegated act, because nearly everything which we would do, which would require a CAP to get together with an ISP, would implicitly or explicitly be in contravention of the regulation. You can't delegate something which goes contrary to the regulation. Secondly, we've got the code. What does the code allow us? Okay, let's think about it. Is this some form of tax or is it some form of universal service obligation? The universal service obligation, it's Article 92, I believe, basically says this is what universal service is, set at a very low level. Anything above that, out. You can't tax anybody for it. So, so you can't tax anybody for it. So clearly what would be proposed would have to be separate. It couldn't fall under Article 92. Then the question is, can it fall under a delegated act? The delegated acts cover emergency services, clearly not that. Transparency and stuff like that, maybe, but it's really gilding the lily, I think, to say that it's transparency. And the other one was the correction of the annexes. Now, the annexes are mentioned, it's 6, 9, 10, whatever. The one that it doesn't mention is the one on co-investment. So you can't change that. So you can't change the one that really matters. You can only change transparency. I think it would be asking a bit much to say that what is being proposed here in any way, shape or form could fit within there. Therefore, we'd have to have a new law. A new law would have to go under 114. And then the question is, what would the modalities of that be? Would they be transfers by CAPS to ISPs? That seems to be our contrario to TSM regulation, net neutrality. Would they be a universal service fund a la US to which we contribute? I don't think that would pose a theoretical problem and it would be okay. The question then is, as Martin was saying, as you were alluding to as well, who does it go to? So I would imagine, because I consider the code to be very pro-incumbent, I would consider that the best party to administer it on a pan-European basis for pan-European goals would in fact be the Commission. And they could transparently tell us where it's going to, for what purpose, because basically it's a glorified state aids regime. So I would suggest that would be the way to do it if you're going to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I must say I was also thinking about the universal service obligation, because it states that there should be an adequate broadband access, and it is now it's now in the annex, and I think you should look into the future and see whether this is still sufficient. So I think there could be a basis in using the universal service fund, and even right now, if there are areas that do not offer sufficient adequate broadband access, then there is a possibility to impose a universal service obligation, and there's already in a code that then the OTTs should contribute to that. But now it's only related to their to the messaging services, just to say. So there is already a mechanism, but it is not really looking forward to the future. And there's also, well, there is a new tool to ask for rollout plans and to monitor the future rollout of broadband networks, and also see whether there will be well, difficulties in the future. But there is not a real, there is a link, but it's not very clear how they are connected. So maybe, but again, this is only using the method of universal service only for areas where there is not enough competition, and there are not, well, there are not a high, there's not a high capacity network available also for future adequate broadband access. And well, and of course the code has a general clauses about dispute resolution, and you may use it if there's a discussion, but it doesn't. It's well. I think also for using that mechanism, the scope should be a little bit broader than it is right now. But maybe I'm not sure. Maybe we can use, or the Commission can use soft law to guide dispute resolution between the CAPs and telcos.
One of the annexes on transparency, at the very end, it talks about dispute resolution, but it clearly, the implication is that it's dispute resolution between end customer and provider. So it's not really covering that. So I think we need a new law.
Perfect. But in case money actually went from CAPs directly to ISP, of course, there's a question to whom it should go also, because we have network operators, but also companies that rely on access from telecom operators. With respect to mobile, we have both mobile network operators, but also mobile virtual network operators. In case money went directly from CAPs to ISPs or to network operators, would there have to be a requirement for the money to go for investment? Because if it's not, then maybe they would just use it to pay higher dividends to their shareholders, right? Or they could maybe, what if they invest, but they don't invest in networks, but someone else, in order to diversify the portfolio? So I think that there are a number of issues with this direct compensation mechanism that would be between the companies. But Martin, do you want to add anything on that? If not, I would move to net neutrality debate.
I think if I may, I'll pass on that one. I've got a few things to say about net neutrality in a moment.
Perfect. So that's what I wanted to ask you. How do you think that the whole debate about fair contribution can coexist or can actually take place without violating net neutrality rules? And in the first place, what do we know about the impact of net neutrality rules on investment?
Well, I'll deal with this with the second question. Anna, you referred in your introduction to a number of papers which have suggested that there is an impact on investment from the presence as opposed to the absence of net neutrality rules. And I have been reading some of those papers. The one that struck me as being most interesting was one which is based upon an analysis of the impact of net neutrality rules in a set of 32 OECD countries over a fairly extensive period in which they were kind of coming or going. And this reached a fairly strong conclusion. It's a tremendously complicated estimation process, so I think we have to discount for that. But the conclusion that the authors reached, they were Briglauer, Cambini, and others in the European Journal of Law and Economics, was that net neutrality regulations exert a significant and strong negative impact on fiber investments. I'm sure, Anna, your researchers have led you to look at that paper too. But it does, in a sense, it doesn't surprise me, because the net neutrality regulations are quite restrictive of what networks can do. And normally speaking, if you restrict firms' abilities to grow their businesses, then there's probably going to be a price. They're going to be less investable than they might otherwise be. But there's a very important correlate of this, which is that the only variable that we found an impact of net neutrality on in the paper is is fiber investments, but all sorts of other things may be going on. The authors are very clear to say that this is not a conclusion about welfare, because the benefits which the firms are getting may actually, for example, be from exhibiting a lot of self-preference for their affiliated content and things of that kind, which are ultimately not beneficial for consumers. So I think the answer to the question is what I expect the answer to be. I would expect net neutrality to have a detrimental effect upon investment, but whether that is sufficient to outweigh the benefits that net neutrality has given, I can't really give another proposition. And then, of course, there are wider social and democratic issues involved in the debate, and those have to be taken into account too. So I think the jury's still a bit out on that. But if you really want to go for investment and go for growth, I'd have thought it might make sense to look at some abatement of the net neutrality rules. And I think I'm right in saying that's what the UK telecommunications regulator Ofcom is looking at the moment.
Would you like to comment on net neutrality, Gera and here?
Yeah, so the question, whether is it a source of a problem or the solution? Yeah, I think net neutrality is, well, it is there, and I think it's a good principle, but it influences the negotiating power, I think. So in case authorities may looking into a negotiation, or maybe from a competition law perspective to the negotiations, then well, the open internet regulation should take it into account, because it doesn't give the internet access provider the possibilities to really act and just well, because they need to be open and to stay open. So it cannot be used. And I think as such that's a good thing, but it should be taken into account. So source of the problem, well, some may say that. I think I wouldn't mention that. And the solution, well, the solution must be, I think, taken into account the effects, and also, well, the fact that as a society we like to, well, at least in Europe, to keep the internet open. So that should be taken into account when assessing possible disputes between the caps and telcos.
I tend to agree with you. One of the only benefits of getting old is that you can actually remember things that happened historically. And I remember when we enacted net neutrality, there was absolutely no reason whatsoever to do so in Europe. There was not one complaint in any member state about anything to do with it. And European parliamentarians looked across and they said, oh, America's much more liberal than Europe in this. We have to be more liberal than them. And that's how we got net neutrality. We didn't need it. There was no need for it. We had competitive markets. We've had super competitive markets in telecoms. As Martin said earlier, it's been a great success if you measure it on any normal parameter of competitiveness. And we probably could have dealt with net neutrality type issues through the use of dominance, because let's face it, who is going to throttle unless they're dominant? You're not going to throttle if you're small. So we didn't need it. Now we're stuck with it. Okay. And it's worse than that, because every time BEREC tried to be reasonable, and it has been very reasonable now with slicing, for example, which basically says, look, you can do it. You can provide your own services as long as you don't thwart the overall capacity. Okay. But we've got the court. And let's not forget that a few cases went to the court a couple of years ago on the net neutrality issue. And none of us really cared that much about zero rating, but the court, whoa, very angry. No efficiency arguments, no zero rating possibilities. So we're stuck with net neutrality. There doesn't seem to be any desire on the part of European parliamentarians to backtrack. The Commission isn't going to take them on. And the Council thinks that they're in their home states, they're going to lose votes from young people. So we're stuck with net neutrality. Is it a problem? Yes, I think it is. it has thwarted the sort of upward or downward investment that I think telcos could have made, in theory, to produce their own services. But we have to live with it. Does it block us from doing some fair share system? I would suggest no, if we go down the universal service model delivered by one entity like the Commission and distributed according to objective criteria, which don't have to do with your content relationship with telco X or telco Y. As long as they have to do with Europe delivering a better broadband solution in areas X, Y, and Z, I think it's possible. It's not contrary to net neutrality. But I think once you get a scenario whereby it's telco negotiating with CAP, then you're going to constantly have problems with the open network, internet regulation issues.
Now that you have mentioned that when the open net neutrality regulation was adopted, there was no need for that. But you also mentioned that in your view, we are stuck with this and it can't be undone. Why do you think it's the case? Is it because kind of undoing it would mean that the Commission would have to kind of confirm we were wrong about it? Or why do you think we have to stuck with this? Because in the end, some laws can be repealed. Regulation, I think it was 887 on a local loop, at some point was revoked because it fulfilled its goal. It just expired. Could we have kind of a solution for either not repealing net neutrality regulation, but at least maybe introducing changes where we could have a distinction between either weak or strong net neutrality that was proposed by Joshua Gans, or any type of differentiation on, let's say, net neutrality vis-a-vis consumer and net neutrality in traffic management?
Greek philosopher Diogenes was blind and he walked the streets of Athens with a cane looking for an honest man. I think if I try to find a situation where the Commission has said, we got it wrong, let's do it again, I'm in a very Diogenistic sort of scenario, I believe. One of my, I notice there's quite a few lawyers that I've practiced with over the years here. One of the problems with community law, the inflexibility issue, is that we, as Europeans, we develop wonderful structures, but we work with those structures and we tend to change them over time. But we do not have the luxury that a country outside the European Union has, which is to say, Australia, New Zealand, they often say, go to Parliament, and they say, you know what? We got policy X wrong. Let's throw it out. Let's do something completely new. If you try to do that across 27 member states, you have chaos. So you have to change only incrementally. You have to change within the same sort of scope of analysis. And I'm not a Brexiteer, by the way, okay? I want to make it quite clear. But you are stuck with a paradigm and you can't have huge paradigm shifts. You're still working within the paradigm. So we have relevant markets. We build in a mechanism to say that we can have less or more, depending on what we find. You have digital markets, we have a market review mechanism to say we can have less or more, depending on what we find, but it's the same paradigm. So I would say it would be great, but I think that horse has left the stable.
I agree with what you said, but I think it's very unfortunate because given the uncertainty, almost radical uncertainty in times that we live, I think adaptive regulation is the future forward. So more flexible regulation that allow us to respond much faster to the technological evolution of markets. Martin, do you want to jump in?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I have to say, in my knowledge of parliamentary systems is that they don't say we made a mistake. They said the policy has worked. It's worked absolutely brilliantly. It's no longer necessary. Oh, and by the way, and circumstances have changed. So it's just as turned out just as we thought, and so we should press ahead with repeal.
I'm responding to the question here. I have mentioned earlier, I actually would like to refer to two cases. I have mentioned the case in Germany where Meta has stopped paying Deutsche Telekom. And the question in relation to that is, do you expect that, of course, there are some commercial agreement between CAPs and telecom operators. So do you expect that in the future there will be more of them? And second is maybe to Martin, very often nowadays, the case of South Korea where there is a case by South Korean broadband telecom operator against Netflix have been used and I think unjustly instrumentalized to show that in South Korea, the rules that they have introduced have been actually harmful to consumers. But I have also seen that apparently Netflix has actually lowered prices by adopting advertising-based model. So my question to you would be about the South Korean case and whether you really think that consumers have been worse off, because this is the example that is really cited everywhere now to show that neutrality actually is a good thing. And if we depart from that, we will end up as South Korean consumers.
My impression is that there's always a degree of uncertainty about causation and in cases of this kind. And I'm aware that changes which have alleged to be made in South Korea are often used by proponents of sticking where we are against that. And I think it's an issue that can be examined, but you probably aren't going to get a clear and unambiguous result when you've gone into it. And so it's a risk, and I think it might be present in this case that we get stuck with a kind of let's stick with the familiar. There'll clearly be disruption cost if we change it. And anyway, it's not too bad after all. But the truth is some of these cause and effect relationships are extremely difficult to untangle. The case that I've mentioned earlier about the impact on fiber investment of net neutrality illustrates that. So there are, we can get so far, but the inherent conservatism of many systems makes it quite difficult to go what might be in fact slightly a little bit further, which will be better.
By the way, the study that you have mentioned by Cambini and Briglauer, I think it covers only fiber and not mobile, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that actually the empirical studies, the few of them are inconclusive because I can't remember now the author, but the study from the US was actually showing that there was no negative impact of net neutrality on investment. Of course, we have to take it into consideration that net neutrality rules in the US have been repealed, but still in the moment of existence, apparently there was no negative impact. So I think we will have to wait for more empirical studies on the topic to see what is really happening. How does net neutrality affect investment? And in this regard, it would be interesting to see or to compare the situation in Australia and New Zealand, which do not have any net neutrality rules. Do you want to comment on the German case? Do you think that there will be more legal disputes between CAPs and telcos in relation to already existing IP peering agreements?
I'm not in a position to comment on that.
Yeah.
Sure.
Not being involved in the proceedings and not knowing enough about the details, there's a lot of lawyers here that they'll tell you each case is very, very specific. It could be just a purely commercial dispute. It could be a dispute designed to throw up a particular question, like you're suggesting. Let's test the water. Let's see if somebody's got the stomach for this. Who knows? I really don't know.
Same for me, but I think there might be another reason, because for disputes, and that's also the implementation of the DMA, which will affect the content application providers and which will influence their business models. So it might be that they are less reluctant to also be that contributive to agreements with telcos. So I think while looking at the DMA and the changes, and also the obligations for interoperability, I guess there will be in the future more focus and probably also disputes on the implementation of the DMA than than these disputes. But it's just these are just my thoughts. I cannot substantiate it, but I think I'm afraid this will be the case.
Okay, thank you. Person from the audience is asking whether it's possible to stop sharing the question so they can actually see the speakers on the screen, because apparently they don't see them. Thank you. And I will take the question from the audience here online. We have already mentioned that one of the problems may be of underinvestment, but the question here is there really a problem of financial resources? So does more money, does more cash flow mean that there would be more investment? Martin, I think that's the question to you.
Well, shall I have a go at that? I'm afraid it's really economics 101 that I'm appealing to at the moment. It's really the issue of the terms on which the investments are available, and that's mostly to do with interest rate and cost of capital, but not entirely, because there are highly complex ways of structuring these investments. But I suppose the proposition is that if a lot of investment was seen as coming into the industry, then the effect would be to inspirit the allegedly rather demoralized telecoms operators in Europe, and encourage a kind of more vigorous animal spirits within the sector, and that might be in principle a way in which these effects should take their course.
Okay, thank you. I see there are 2 questions from the audience. 3.
Good afternoon, Manuel Braga Montego, working for Vodafone. So I'm biased on this debate, so I'll start with that. But I really appreciate the organization of this event, because being 2 kilometers away from the EU district, one has a different discussion, listen to different arguments. It's healthy, I would say, and I appreciate that. 2 comments and one question, because the code, it may be really looking good on paper, but in many member states it was not implemented yet. The co-investment, there is still no co-investment 2.5 years down the road. So I don't know, and the Commission is already looking into 2025 and reopening it, or at least looking in how far it should be reopened. So may look good on paper, not really working in practice, and not the new objective of VHC investment is not there. Comment, and I to Peter, what you said on why didn't we invest in other things? We are running for 12 years. We don't recoup our investments. We are working on below cost of capital for 12 years. So even when we tried, and companies did try in different ways, it's very difficult for the sector to reinvent itself. When we tried to do an internet-based messaging system, Digicomp, when we tried to discuss that, the 5 largest operator, Digicomp, knocked on our door and said, okay, no, you cannot do it like that. You need to bring it into the GSMA or something like that. So it's not always so straightforward to invest in different things beyond connectivity. The question on would be on, there are 3 different models that are being discussed in the public sphere, which would be an own resource for the Commission, so a new form of own resource, being caps, putting money. The other one would be national funds, and the other one is the one pushed by ETNO on the commercial negotiation and regulatory backstop. From a legal and an economic perspective, which one do you believe, with your experience, that could be easier to fly in the discussion?
This one, yeah. Well, thanks. Yes, it is unfortunate that that's always the problem with on your first point. Implementation is always the bugaboo of all regulation. It can look great on paper, and what the Commission has tried to do is to be helpful on paper. But let's see how that develops. In terms of which structure would work the best, like my views are quite clear from a legal, pragmatic, and compatibility point of view. If you go for a universal service fund administered centrally by the Commission, you have a couple of advantages. You get away from this net neutrality problem, because once you start negotiating between a CAP and an ISP, there'll be somebody, maybe not you, but maybe somebody else going to court and complaining about it. Oh, it's contrary to the net neutrality regulation. 3 years in court, then appeal to the ECJ. I mean, it never ends. You know what lawyers are like. But so there's that issue. So you make it central, you make it in the hands of the Commission, you make it transparent, and it's quite clear they're getting the money, they're audited, and they will put the money towards the investment. And then the question is, it's up to industry to then negotiate with the Commission and say to them, listen, this is where we think it's most efficient, and this is where we think we can contribute. Okay, that's a separate debate. But I really do think that for me, all roads lead to Rome, or Florence in your case. And what we have is a situation where if the Commission administers it, most of us around this table at least will be comfortable that there's no regulatory capture by the national incumbent, because that will be a complaint that lawyers will raise. And we will say that there's no capture of the member state in question. So then let's let the member state fight with the Commission and sort out whether what the Commission is doing is right, and industry can see whether or not it's transparent. And I think that option, if you're going to go for that, if you're going to go for an option, that is the option which is the path of least resistance, in my view.
More questions from the audience?
If I could just come in quickly, I think one strong strand of my thought about this is that it does have expressly redistributive objectives, and it should have expressly redistributive objectives. That's to say, I think the notion of universal gigabit connectivity is a very noble objective, and one which is quite appropriate for a body like the European institutions actually to promote. And given that that's likely to be it, then the arrangement that Peter has described seems much better calculated to ensure that the money goes in the direction in which it's most needed. And so for that reason, I'd be inclined to favour that, because quite honestly, the description in the various proposals that I've seen for the form of the commercial negotiations which will take place, subject to a dispute resolution condition. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but it did strike me as being pretty flaky.
Thank you, Martin. Then I would like to move quickly with the questions from the audience. I would like to ask you to be brief because we are approaching towards the end of this panel. No problem.
Yes, I'm a regulator. So first of all, I don't want to get involved in disputes. So that's the first reason. Second one, okay, I understand the fund that looks let's say a less mercantile way to do a transfer from OT&T players to telecom operators. But the arguments we get from let's say incumbents is yes, but on a European level, all the money will flow to Eastern Europe, because there's most likely will the need be higher than, let's say, Belgium, who has already a very dense coverage. And on the second argument, but it's maybe less convincing. Yeah, if you look at European funds, there's much waste, and Olaf subsidies go everywhere, and maybe not to the goals that were initially on the as the goal setting. So that's what we get as feedback from our local operators.
Maybe for the sake of time, we would collect all the 3 questions and then we can answer all of them together. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and Matthew Newman from MLEX. Thanks for a great debate. And Peter, I just wanted to press you a little bit more about your solution on the universal obligation. It does sound like that's what makes sense, but oftentimes what makes sense is not what is actually decided. And the reason I say that is because it doesn't really solve the company's problem. And that's what Anna described very well, which is the return on investment and getting investors to fund new networks. Because what would happen actually, and here's the question: if you have a universal obligation, and the commission says, well, that money should actually go to poor areas and help poor people connect to broadband. And then the telecom companies would say, well, that's not what we want. What we want is more investment for other parts of our network. We don't necessarily want all these subsidies to put high-speed internet in rural areas. That's not really what our interests are. So you have a clash of interests there. And then you have, if the member states understand that there's a huge pot of money that's available, they're going to want to use it and distribute where they want it. And the commission will never get its hands on it. So it's a good idea, I admit, but I think it confronts sort of the realities of the market, and also the political realities where the member states would like to keep control over this big honeypot. I just want to, what do you think of that?
There's one question from David.
Thank you, and thank you everybody on the panel. David Geary from the Digicel Group. Just a point on the data. We saw earlier that the big tech data is going down, but I think you'll find from studies I've seen, the reason behind that is the growth of TikTok data. So if you included TikTok, the figure would go up. A key policy question, I think, is the disaggregation of income from services from network cost recovery. That was always part of the telco model. And I suppose a key question for policymakers is, how do you reconnect revenues from services to revenue to the recovering costs for networks? Fair share seems to throw up some key policy questions for policymakers. Is there a problem with funding networks? If there is, how do you address it? If it's possible to recover the entirety of the cost from consumers, is that right? When the users of the networks are making what appear to be supernormal profits. If it's not possible, is it right that the state or the European Commission has to intervene somehow to make up that shortfall? So the Broadband Commission, the ITU UNESCO Broadband Commission, just as a point of information, published a report in 2021 that looked at all of these issues, including the Australia regulatory model, USF, and an international fund, and I just commend it to people who are interested in this topic, because it does consider these issues. Just my question then on net neutrality. If you look back to how we ended up with net neutrality in Europe, there was a concerted campaign by big tech to introduce this. And one of the reasons was because they saw this debate coming. They knew it was going to come back. So they lobbied very, very hard indeed. And some of the tactics involved would be classed as a disinformation campaign today and wouldn't be tolerated anymore. So in that context, is there a ground to go back and look at how we ended up at net neutrality, and whether there are actually any positive benefits that couldn't have been achieved by other regulation, and maybe to amend the regulation or to do away with it altogether? Thank you.
Thank you for all the questions. I would now like to ask the speaker to reply. And while replying, if there's any key takeaway message that you would like the audience to remember, then I would like you to ask you to conclude with that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, shall I go first? I think we've heard some very, very cogent problems put in front of us with these last three questions, particularly the problems about distributional issues and member states trying to get their paws on the money, and distribute it the way they want, rather than the way in which it might be best used. But you know, we live in the real world, and that happens all the time. And we shouldn't necessarily be in a position where we let the best be the enemy of the good. It's not going to be perfect. Peter has argued it's the best option available, but it's not going to be perfect. And as for the question of whether it might be possible ex post facto to repeal the legislation, I'm unqualified to comment on that.
Thank you. Gerda?
Yeah, I'm reflecting on the questions about the fact that if you use universal service, then it is mainly to promote broadband access in regions where there is no sufficient broadband access. But I think if you like to have a system and use another basis, then it should probably be the dispute resolution and the fairness in negotiations. And well, as we have discussed before, the code is not giving a real sufficient basis for that, but it might be the most easiest way is to look into the DMA and look whether there could be one of the obligations for reasonable negotiations imposed on the big content application providers. But again, it doesn't then say anything about a specific outcome, but at least you have a framework where you might be able to give some guidelines on the way how to negotiate.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay, from memory, you know, memory fades. Could a EU administered code take into account national specificities? Possibly, probably. Member states should be part of the monitoring process. Member states should be able to present their case. All I ask for is transparency. What we're asking for is essentially a universal service code. You're right that it might go to, most of it might go to the Eastern European countries. We need to balance that out, not because the Eastern European countries are a problem. Let's face it, what's the biggest problem with state aids? Everybody thinks it's all the poor people, you know, all the poor countries giving money out. No, poor countries are poor because they don't have money. It's the rich countries that give state aid. You know, ask the lawyers who administer the state aid programs. Germany versus the Commission, Germany versus the Commission. It's not, you know, Slovakia versus the Commission for state aids all the time. It's Germany versus the Commission because they've got the money. So I hear your point, but I'm trying to address something you said also, Matthew. But I think bringing the member states in under the Commission, having them negotiate, let them fight it out, but don't make it appear as if you're getting a system which is giving money from one group of operators to another group of operators, ill-defined and arguably, you know, wanting that. I think that's the key. I think that's the key. Transparency has to be the issue. Okay. The other point being, you've mentioned the DMA. I think DMA, the most exciting thing about the DMA is that it provides the possibility, real possibility, for mobile operators especially, and telcos secondary, to get into the DMA space and be service providers if they're nimble enough. I think that could be quite interesting. Your point about the gentleman here from Digicel about, you know, net neutrality debate, couldn't agree more. That's why I thought it was wrong in the first place. If anybody gains from net neutrality, of course, it's big tech. But it's wrong though to portray it as a free ride. It's just a model. Now, why did they get that model? I don't think they should have got the model because it was unnecessary from a regulatory policy lawyer's point of view. From your point of view, it's probably unnecessary because it didn't work with your business model. I get that. But from my point of view, it didn't quite work. From a redistributive point of view, I tend to agree with Martin that we need to be seeing this as a transfer from society for a reason to develop broadband. If it's got certain elements of state aids, so be it. If it got certain elements of state selectivity, so be it, but let it be rationalized and, you know, proportionate and be clear to everybody so we know what we're dealing with.
Thank you so much. We are already beyond time, but there are so many issues that still need to be discussed. So of course, we will be all probably attending other events. I would like to thank all the speakers for their contribution to the debate, for all the questions from the audience and hear from you. Now we have a break. Now we have a break and then we will have a second panel. Thank you all.